for the introduction. Yeah, my legal name is Roger, but everybody calls me Obi. You all can and should call me Obi. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and let's go ahead and just jump right into talking about comic books as archaeological data points, and maybe thinking creatively about how we can save some of these ephemeral little scraps of history. Let's see, now I've tested all my technological things and then still I get like some type of a snafu. Okay, so backstory is that comic books really were initially born as a medium in 1897 with this ability to mass print line drawings. And then that technology caught on in the early 20th century, and by the 1930s, comic books had become pretty common. They were available at newsstands and secondary distributors in all of the major cities of the United States and really the English-speaking world. And they continue to be mass-produced all the way through the 20th century into the present day. I think that an argument could be made that the peak popularity and influence of comic books has been achieved sometime in the mid to late 20th century, and that the 21st century comic books are perhaps a little bit less popular, but nonetheless, in the 21st century, we live in the artistic legacy of the comic book era, and their imprint will be with us for a really long time to come. And so they have a special place in art history and in pop culture history. And so the general kind of argument behind my talk tonight is that we should be trying to record these as data points and that they have a lot of value and meaning to us. But then really, I hope you buy that argument already, at least on some level, because we're going to focus on technical aspects related to how to collect them and preserve them. The main thing to keep in mind about comic books is that they are supremely diagnostic. They have a lot of wonderful details about them that make them useful to us as archaeologists. And a good way to remember those kind of main points that we're going to get from comic books, I've kind of summarized into a mnemonic called PAID. So you're going to look for price, you're going to look for art, you're going to look for identity, and you are going to look for a date. And similarly so, if you can get any one of those things, then you can use that to piece together with the others. So once you've identified exactly what comic book it is that you're looking at, even if you can't see the price of it, you could then extrapolate the price on the back end during your secondary research. I also just want to point out that these two covers, you've got on the left a reprint of the original Superman comic, and then on the right you've got Spider-Man, the artists clearly reacting to the iconic Superman image, but under a different publisher and several decades after that had originally been published. So I'm going to assume that in most cases where we're engaging with comic books in an archaeological setting, they're going to be somewhat partial or damaged. And so we're going to be looking for specific little diagnostic characteristics that we can latch onto and use for our archaeological analysis. So the main thing, probably the single most useful thing that you might get out of this talk tonight, is that you can look for the price of a comic book. And this is going to be available on the cover, and the cover of comic books are sealed in some different chemicals that give them that glossy effect and help them to survive the elements a lot longer than the newsprint interior. So if you're able to get a price on the cover of a comic book, then that's going to give you an instant sense of its possible date range. And so all of these prices that I have listed here are going to be in the date ranges that we're interested in. And I include 25-cent comics here because that became the standardized price of comic books in 1977. But before that, there were annuals and special collections and special editions that were 25 cents or 15 cents. And so a vast majority of comic books that have been published for 25 cents or less were published before 1972. And that means that they're going to be archaeological. And so if we encounter some scraps of comic books, let's say in an old abandoned homestead looking site, or in a collapsed hunting blind, perhaps in a national forest, or even, if we're really lucky, in a collector's box, in some type of a buried or trashed context, then the price is going to give us an instant sense of at least when this comic book was published. Now, I've grabbed this comic in particular because I think it's interesting that you've got a 12-cent price when it was originally published. Then it actually lost some value, as they did when they were handled and traded around. And somebody stamped directly on the cover a 10-cent cover price. And then it was wrapped in plastic and somebody put a $14 cover price on it. And now it's been assigned the value of good, and its retail value is somewhat more than $14 now. And so, I think that this cover in particular tells a story of multiple different kind of eras, and this artifact has gone through a journey, or this document has gone through a journey. Art is the A in paid, and it is, I think, maybe the most significant visual element of what we might document and think about on the analysis side. Little fragments and scraps of art could be hard to identify, especially for rare or esoteric comics. But for the most part, if you have a decent amount of the art on the front or back cover, then it can be traced back to the original issue. And the rest of this information can be extrapolated by a lab technician. But also, just looking at the art itself, I think that there's some value to thinking about that as a data point and what it might tell you about the time that these comic books were being read and consumed. The I in paid is identity. And here I have some examples of a very literal and direct identification, where you have 3 different instances of someone's name actually being added directly to a comic book cover. And just, I find a special kind of emotional connection to these. I think it's really beautiful to look at it and think about that person and their name. And unless field technicians are looking for this type of little ephemeral piece of evidence, there's a good chance that it's going to get missed. So the discerning field technician, if they encounter some fairly intact comics, are going to want to look for little identifiers like this. But in a broader sense, we learn something about the interests of the individuals who occupied a site. And we also start to get some interesting historical information out of that, especially as it might pertain to the 30s, 40s, 50s, And so then we have dates that come from comic books. And this, if you can get it from the comic itself, of course, that's a shortcut to getting a date for some aspect of your site. And you can think about this in horizontal or vertical dimensions. So if you are wandering through national forest on a transect line, looking at the ground, wondering, if you're approaching an archaeological site of the historic period or not, and you see a date that suggests that it's pre-1972, then you have really concrete evidence that you have encountered the horizontal extent of a historic site. And similarly so, if you have vertical levels that you're working with and you're like, ceramics and some rusted metal, and we don't really know when this is from, and then you have maybe a stack of semi-ruined comic books that are all stuck together and stained, but you can see that top cover on it, and if you can see a date on that, that might suddenly give you a date for that depth as well. And then, of course, I think that these are interesting and fun examples because they have secondary dates stamped on them that tell you another chapter of the story of where this document has been, and probably that it was resold at some time. So those are already paid, is already kind of the basic skeleton of a talk that I gave to the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists. And since y'all have agreed to join me for a longer amount of time than I had there, I wanted to dig deeper into advanced tips. So the things that we're going to be looking for as really advanced archaeological field technicians looking at comic books in the field are going to be the indicia. We're going to think about the taphonomy of the book. We're going to open our minds to comic books as a medium rather than a genre. And we're going to disregard comic books with glossy pages. The indicia is a little publisher's imprint that's sort of embedded someplace in most comic books. It's usually on the inside of the front cover or the first page. Sometimes it's on the last page. In this particular case, this was on the fourth page of this comic. And so you may have to do a little bit of digging, and this is something that is not going to be available if the book is extremely damaged. But you can get some really detailed publisher information from the indicia. And I also have encountered one site in particular, an old homestead site, or that had been initially established as a homestead, but it was occupied through until the early 40s. And they had newspapers that were plastered all over the insides of the walls, probably as wallpaper. And so we got a lot of dates for like precisely when those walls were wallpapered. And that gave us a sense of, even though this site was established in the late 1860s, it was actually occupied at least until the 1940s because we had those newspapers there. So, it's conceivable that you would encounter the indicia without the cover. And in fact, another really powerful example of that is that distributors and sellers used to rip the covers off of unsold copies and then report them as unsold, and then they were supposed to destroy those copies. But there was a huge black market for these coverless comics. And so although without the cover, they're a lot less likely to survive, especially because they weren't treated as collectors' items without the cover. It's still conceivable that there are these coverless comics out there somewhere in the archaeological record, and that you're going to be able to identify a comic through the indicia. And I've also made it this far in my talk without giving any indecent puns. So round of applause. Then we're going to think about the taphonomy of the comic book. And taphonomy is our fancy archaeological word for the history or the story of how this artifact got to its present location and state of being. So, you know, from when it was last used by a person for cultural purposes and they have discarded it or left it for whatever reason, what has happened to it since then is the taphonomy of an object. And so the thing to keep in mind with comic books is that they are very fragile, they age quickly, and they have a lot of enemies to their well-being. Those include heat, sun, moisture. They include all sorts of animals, from invertebrates to vertebrates. And it's also possible that rodent collecting or bird collecting is going to result in a little collection of comic books at an archaeological site that perhaps survive. So collapsed in or buried rodent's den might be the location of comic book scraps that are discovered later by an archaeologist who's digging up this area. And then in general, that's going to tell you pretty quickly if the comic books are old or not. If they look pristine and they're on the surface, there's almost no chance that they're an artifact. As where if you're looking at really damaged, flaked, crumpled, moldy, chewed on little bits of colorful art, that's probably the comic book scrap that you're looking for. That's probably an artifact. And because they're so ephemeral, you know, it's going to be your discerning eye as the advanced archaeological field technician who notices that and sees it and thinks to take a picture of that before it's gone forever. It's important to bear in mind that comic books are a medium and not a genre. And Stacy actually kind of clued us into this early on when she said that she liked Archie comics and she liked the colors. When I did an oral history with my dad on his experience with comic books, because he was born in 1939 and lived with comic books as a child that we now would think of as archaeological, he mentioned his love of the colors in comic books as a little boy. And so I think it's important to remember that comic books are a very powerful visual medium, and that a lot of different types of artists and storytellers have jumped into that space and tried to tell stories there. So there's a wide range of genre that we might encounter in the field, and we want to be open to that, because by being open to the niche interests of the previous occupants of a site, we're going to learn a lot more about them, rather than committing confirmation bias and sort of thinking, you know, oh, well, you know, we're looking for superheroes, and if we don't find superheroes, then we didn't find comic books. And that really just might not be the case, especially for the 30s and 40s and 50s. There were a whole wide variety of genre that were consumed by a wide variety of audiences. And we'll kind of get back to this a little bit later too, but you know, the exact genre or story that's being consumed by occupants at the site might also clue us in about their identity and interests a little bit more as well. Now I've got a special note about glossy pages, and I did not include a picture of a comic book with a glossy page so that your brain doesn't remember glossy pages and you don't think you saw them, because you didn't, because they're not archaeological. If you encounter the glossy interior pages in a comic book, it was made at least in the late 1980s or more recent. It does not fall within the scope of our research, however interesting it may be. And so for the sake of efficient time management in the field, we're going to go ahead and disregard it. Here's a quick little flow chart of decision making that I put together for the CCPA talk with the help of my friend Jacob. And it is designed to just kind of help a field technician think about simply, should I take the time to record this or not? And really kind of just to identify, oh yes, this is an archaeological specimen or not. So I'll let you kind of take it in visually for just a moment. And this is one of the main takeaways. So if you want to screenshot anything, this is a good thing to screenshot here. So are you looking at an intact cover? If the answer is yes, then you should find, or whatever portion of it is intact, you're going to look at that and you're going to ask, do I have a price of 25 cents or less? If the answer is yes, record it. If you have a price that's 35 cents, 50 cents, 75 cents or more, disregard it as modern. Although be aware that inflation started hitting the comic book industry really hard in the late 70s. So in the late 2020s and then into the 2030s, we're going to see the rules for this change as the prices that are considered historic era start to increase. If you've got glossy pages, ignore it. If it doesn't have glossy pages, don't really have a cover, look for the indicia. And if the indicia is there, it's going to have some type of date information. If the date is old enough, record it. If it's not, don't. If you can't find the indicia or the date is unspecified for some reason, sometimes indie comics will state who the publisher is, but they don't actually include a date, then it can't hurt to take a picture of that indicia real quick, make sure it's not blurry, and send that off to the lab for labbies to look at. So when you're recording a specimen in the field, what are you wanting to record? What is going to be the most useful? And on just kind of the most abstract, kind of open-ended meta level, you can think, what would I wish I had as the lab technician or as the report writer? What would I need at the bare minimum in order to learn more about this comic book and identify what it is? And so that mostly boils down to pictures. If you can get pictures of the front and back cover, whatever's intact of them, the indicia, the centerfold, if there is one, and maybe some of the advertisements. Advertisements can be really, really interesting and really, really dateable. And then you should record coordinates. These days, that obviously just takes the form of dropping a quick GPS point on the horizontal coordinates, assuming that you're doing like some type of pedestrian survey. And if you encounter this in an excavation setting, then you'll record 3D coordinates where you get X, Y, and Z depth. And the Z depth is really important to note because it's going to really help you to add timing and context to those layers. And then if you can give some type of a basic 1 or 2 sentence narrative description that says the cover is intact and it's a phantom comic, or the interior is newsprint and it's totally chewed up by insects, or especially if any of your super diagnostic traits, the paid traits, are there. If you can identify the price, if you can clearly identify the art, like saying, you know, it's Spider-Man or saying it is Archie. If you have a name or a secondary date stamped or something, you know, kind of unique and special about it, that might tell us something about the identity of who owned it or what they were like, then definitely try to describe that real quick in your narrative. And then if there's any type of dateable information, especially if there's like a little number 119 or something like that, that can be really useful. And trying, you know, because, you know, if we knew it was phantom number 119, that would be enough for us to connect those dots and get back to the original kind of pristine looking phantom that maybe the occupants of that site had read. And then that was kind of, those were kind of tips for if you're collecting digital information. If you are going to go that additional step and collect physical specimens, then these are some things to keep in mind. Specifically for comic books, these Mylar sleeves have been mass produced, and they're lovely because they meet all of these conditions, especially because they're chemically formulated so that they don't damage comic books by touching them like other plastics can, or like certain types of acidic papers can damage them. So these Mylar sleeves are archival grade, and you can store comic book pieces in them. But if you don't have those on hand, you should do something to seal it off. And then you want to keep it cool. Heat, especially in an unstabilized specimen that's been excavated, is going to destroy that specimen and cause it to flake. And you know, there are times when you can read it perfectly, beautifully legible right there in front of you, and then you touch it and it just disintegrates into tiny ash. Like particles, you know, that happens from heat. So if you can protect it from the hot field truck and protect it from sitting on the dash of the field truck where it sits in the sun, then that is going to really help keep your specimens from getting heat destroyed. UV rays are also very damaging to the cover art, and it can cause the cracking, and once the cracks form, then they fall apart. So keeping it away from the sun, keeping it dry. Moisture obviously is going to change the state of the paper, and then anything that you can do to support the structure so it's not bending and flexing. In general, you can just think of them as art or historical documents and little fragments of them. And what we're doing as archaeologists is we are out there gathering these little fragments of art and historical documents for the record, which is not unlike the role that archaeologists play at other times. And what I'm hoping that we will do through this both digital collection and potentially the physical collection of specimens is that we're going to provide data points that someday historians and people who are not archaeologists perhaps are going to try to weave together into some type of a narrative when they try to understand what the distant 20th century was like. Here are my citations. We're about 30 minutes in, so we're under time, which means that we have time for a bonus slide. Also, the BS slide. And so I'm going to draw your attention to some interesting things that I think point to the kinds of research that are being done on comic books these days, and why they might be relevant to social scientists. And this is going to start to look more at the lab technicians' interests and also at the report writers' interests. And also, I think I can hear my neighbor's child screaming. So if that's coming through over the Zoom call, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about that. But so this one here in the bottom left-hand corner, I want to point out that the price is listed also in UK pence, right? And that comic books in the English language have had a wide readership, not only in the continental US, but much, much further throughout the English-speaking world. And these days, I know Mile High Comics sells a lot of comics to Australia and Australian audiences. And so throughout the English-speaking world, you might encounter comic books that were published in Chicago or New York. And that can start to weave together some type of a global narrative as we look at historical data points. And similarly so, there are comic books that have been published in a wide variety of languages. So comic books that are present at a site that are Spanish language comic books, or in Italian, or in French, or German, or Japanese, might tell you something about the identities of the people who are at that site, and or their interests. And so thinking about what language a comic book is in and thinking about their total distribution and reach could be useful, especially, I think about this a lot in a Colorado context, but for those of you who are doing archaeology all over North America and beyond, this is something that you could still encounter really anywhere in the world at this point. Oh, so it sounds like somebody might have a comment, or they might be popping in. Oh, thanks for letting me know that the child's not coming through. Good to know. Well, so we've pulled up this Archie comic to say that, I thought it was interesting to show that comic books come from different eras, and now our analysis of them has changed and probably will continue to change. And so the way that popular audiences looked at this Archie comic when it originally came out versus how, maybe we interpret this comic now and think about it are probably very different. And I think in another 50 or 60 years, they could be different again. There's a whole wealth of secondary literature on comic books and what they say about dominant views on gender and race. And so I think there's a very valid critique there. And in order for historians to understand that, and in order to get at any type of a quantified, objective understanding of when and where these things were present at archaeological sites, then we're going to have to record that for them. I've got this Joker image because he's clearly from a more modern era. And so he helps provide a little bit of contrast. And same with the Spider-Gwen. They come from a different era of pop art that's being expressed in the comic book medium. And so really, as we look back at the historical era comic books, I think we're getting an interesting perspective on the changes in art through time and what that might mean for us. And it also opens up a whole possibility of archaeology of sort of soft, intangible concepts, such as the interests and thoughts and values of the occupants of a site. And it also maybe opens up the possibility of some archaeology of gender or the archaeology of age, where maybe we start to think, the evidence is suggesting that there were girls at this site, or at least one girl, or the evidence is really suggesting that we had several children, and of course, it's also conceivable that we're going to learn about the childhood interests of adults who were at the site. And something that I found in a bunch of sources from the 40s and 50s is that already they acknowledge that there's a wide readership among adults of comic books as well. So even as early as the 40s and 50s, I think it was pretty widely acknowledged and just true that adults were reading comic books almost as often as children, although maybe the titles that they were most interested in would change. And we even have an extra bonus slide if it'll pop up. Where's my extra bonus slide? Hey, there's my extra bonus slide. So I want to let you all know that there are a lot of primary sources on comic books. And by that, I mean the comic books themselves. There are wonderful collections of comic books that are available for your perusal. And there are also early 1930s and 40s and 50s reactions and commentary on comic books that could count as a primary source. Also, I want to add that oral histories are still relevant to things that have happened in the 20th century. In fact, I'm sure that there are people present in the talk today who directly remember things that now, if we encountered them on public lands, they would be considered archaeological artifacts. And so your life experience is relevant and important to this topic. And so are the life experiences of older folks that you may know. And I did oral histories with both of my parents. Both of my parents remember a time of comic books in the early and middle 20th century. And my mom shared one story with me that I thought was really touching and special, and it kind of maybe encapsulated the value of comic books as a historical item. And it was cool, you know, to also explore my own personal history of my family. But my mom told me this story about when she was a little girl, her grandfather would buy subscriptions to Disney comics, and then he would put the little notification of subscription in an envelope for her and her sister on the Christmas tree each year. And each year at Christmas from her grandpa, she would get this Disney subscription, and she just absolutely adored those Disney comics for several years. And then when her grandfather passed, he stopped buying her the subscription to Disney, and she stopped reading it. And so the Disney comics represent a very specific era in her life, or a specific chapter in her life. And I think that, you know, although we might not have the opportunity very often to reconstruct a full story like that, there are a lot of sources that are close at hand to us that we can avail ourselves of and create an interesting historical record about comic books that can be consumed by future generations as they start to do a social science or a history of comic books. You know, they'll rely on us for those data points. And I think that's, I can give you extra BS on this topic for a long time, but I think it would be fantastic to open up the floor for questions and comments from some of the participants. Oh, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
I'd rather see your offspring. It's been too long.
I think somebody might have unmuted there. We have a question about like other, I guess, other things that would have gone along with comic books. I don't really know much about like the early history of them, but were there things like action figures or other items that would have accompanied some of these things? Or was that a later phenomenon that kind of happened around movies and television and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Actually, you're right to sort of think about the multimedia nature of comic books and the fact that for a lot of the publishers, comic books have just been one aspect of their storytelling method. So that as a marketing concept really proliferated more so in the 70s and 80s and beyond. But despite that, early on, it was recognized, especially by Disney, that comic books were just a part of their overall product offering. And then superhero paraphernalia rose along with the genre in comic book form, as did Westerns. And then, you know, to be perfectly honest, I know less about Archie and some of the romance titles. But I think that there is paraphernalia and toys and things that go with that as well. And actually, I'm really glad that you asked this question, because it kind of lets me hint, wink, wink at a talk that I'm working on, which is actually about like the archaeology of toys from the early 20th century. That will, you know, that was actually spurred by this, especially as I was looking at a lot of Disney products from the early 20th century. And actually, I'll just go ahead and put on one little side comment on that, and that is that Bakelite was a common, you know, oh, gosh, what's the term I'm looking for? The substrate for a lot of toys for a long time, and then actually the industry moved away from Bakelite, I think in the 50s. So Bakelite is a fun artifact form that is going to be relevant to the archaeology of toys in a big way.
Yeah, I think it was also jewelry as well during the
That's right.
30s and 40s. Interesting talk. When you're talking about you didn't know about the Archie comics, it was tied to TV cartoons as well. But I wanted to ask you a question about the use of how helpful is it in terms of dating to look at the artwork style and the inks that were being used at the time? Are those useful in chronology?
Yeah, that's a good question, and unfortunately, it's a very difficult one to answer because generally speaking, while there have been eras of comic book form, it is also true that the comic book industry can be very nostalgic and backward looking. And so there are a lot of times where you have misleading covers where you have, maybe an old superhero coming back, from the past, or an old style coming back for a special series of issues or what have you. But if you have an especially advanced or nuanced understanding of comic book history, then there are going to be things that you notice or clue into that are going to give you signs. Like actually, with this Donald Duck comic here, if you were to see the Dell publisher logo in the top left corner, that would instantly clue you into the fact that this is a historical era comic, because Disney only published under Dell, I think through 1953. And then they switched over to Gold Key publishers, and then they were done with Gold Key even by the end of the 60s, I think. So, if you knew what publishers to look for with Disney, then that publisher logo could be an instant dead giveaway.
Yeah, that's what I wondered, if you were more intimately well versed with the publishing aspect of it, that you give the example of who was publishing what for Disney when. That would be an additional thing. Okay. And the only other thing that I wanted to note, when you said using comics and newspapers for wallpaper, that's also a means of insulation.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually, I didn't want to extrapolate too much or get too into kind of a digression, but yeah, actually, with that Homestead site, I really think that what we saw there was evidence of some tremendous poverty during the Depression era, and that's the using the newspaper as insulation and wallpaper, I think, is just one tiny part of that. But
I think it would be very interesting to see some of the findings from an archaeological site or the site itself when you're doing a presentation like this, to show, what these little scraps might look like or what this wall might have looked like. That would be an interesting addition.
Yeah, thank you very much for that feedback. I appreciate that. I want to do a little bit of experimental archaeology that will help to kind of create some damaged specimens that will let us understand a little bit more about the aging processes of comic books. Although luckily some of that research has already been done just by people who are interested in the taphonomy of paper. But then also, you're right that it would be cool to have some archaeological comic books. And probably the single most legitimate critique I've had so far of this whole topic is, but have you seen comic books at sites? yet? Right? And the answer is maybe, because to be totally truthful and frank with you, I have encountered some ephemeral paper scraps before, but I, under the direction of my crew chief, was told to just disregard it. It's too ephemeral, too destroyed, too wet, too nasty. Not really the type of diagnostic artifacts that we were looking for. And that's happened at a couple sites. I was doing a fairly large historical excavation at one point. I won't say exactly when or where, but we had a lot of buried wet papers that I thought were pretty interesting, and we let that go by just because the scale of the excavation was so large and we had so much to look at, and there just wasn't the interest on the part of the field director. So I am hoping that I can convince my fellow practitioners of archaeology that these are data points that are worth gathering, at least in digital form, and then hopefully we'll start generating data points. Because if you get in an academic database and you type in comic books, you'll find that there are tens of thousands of articles. The social sciences are totally enamored of comic books and seem to think that they're very interesting, but there's almost nothing on the archaeology of comic books, and I think we can start to fill that void.
Yeah, I imagine that even comic books are a very good reflection of the times that they're produced in, and of course that would be the big draw for social sciences. But I'm wondering too if that's a way of dating them as well as the topics that they cover.
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, any amount of diagnostic information that's extracted from the cover is going to help you to identify through archival research what that comic book originally was. And that is going to start to give us some type of analytical value. Like we can start to talk about, what does this mean for the site? And we can only really start to do that after we figured out what comic book it is. But we do have some shortcuts, especially in terms of the price. If you can see that price and it's 12 cents, that is an instant clue. And that's one of the most basic things too. That's something that can be easily taught to brand new field technicians. It could be their first day doing archaeology, and you could say, anything that you see these scraps, if it says 25 cents or less, that's, in the historical record, it's super, super easy hack to this.
Two boys. I tried it. Good job. We got it all.
Do we have other questions?
Derail a train.
Well, Obi, we really appreciate it. That was a great topic and a very interesting topic. So it was a perfect, I think we had the perfect forum here for that talk. A diverse audience and a lot of different interests. So it was really good. I'll send you a link to the recording so that you could preview it and just make sure that everything is how you want it, and then can edit it and add it to YouTube. And it'll be available for other members on there. Do we have any final comments for this evening?
I do just want to respond to the typed comments that some folks submitted.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
I want to say thank you for these beautiful haiku, Deb. These are wonderful. I don't want to lose these, so
You're
I've got to
very
make sure.
welcome.
I'm gonna copy and paste these. There we go. I've just got it copied for now. Thank you, Deb. These are really cute and wonderful.
I thought they would make you smile.
It worked. It
Good.
totally worked. I love poetry too, so it really touches me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, I might, as a final parting shot across the prow, I might take us back to where we started and just bring us back to this cover of Hawkman and think about what popular representations of archaeologists maybe say about us and how we might practice archaeology better in the future.
Thank you very much. It's a resource that I don't know if I would have thought of to be on the lookout for.
Bye-bye.
Alrighty, Obi, you've got the con there, so you could either hand the host back over to me, or I think if you click end meeting, it'll end it.
Okie dokie. I'm gonna hit the stop share, and I think I'm gonna bring it over to end. So thank you, everybody.
Be
I really
sure to
appreciate your
save
time and
it,
attention.
please. Save the recording.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Actually,
yeah.
let me give back over control then.
That's right. Thanks, Stacy. I forgot.
Yeah,
It's on.
we had a speaker that did exactly what you were going to do, and
Oh, okay. Well, I've never taken control before like this, so how do I give it back?
So if you hover over my picture on top, you'll get to 3 dots, and you just click on those 3 dots, and it should say make host.
Okay, hovering over you, boom, and made you the host. There we go. Sorry for the awkwardness, everybody.
Oh, that's good.
learning new technology all the time. It's 2022, you know.
never stop learning.
Okay, that looks good. Now I got it.